And in that suspended moment, as the echo rolled away into the piney woods, waiting for the birds to resume their song, waiting for the world to restart, John Wesley Hardin waited for the horror to descend, waited for the crushing guilt that the Bible promised, the sickness of the soul that was supposed to accompany the taking of a life, but it did not come. Instead, there was a cold, crystalline clarity, a fracture in the bedrock of his humanity, where the hot blood of remorse should have flowed, but where only ice remained. He looked at the smoking gun in his hand, not with fear, but with a reverence, realizing that the instrument was not the master, but he was. He realized that the line between the quick and the dead was not drawn by God, but by the speed of the draw and the steadiness of the aim. The dust settled on the body in the road, the red earth turning black where the blood began to pool, a stark, visceral painting of the new reality Hardin had stepped into, a reality where the conscience was a slow-footed traveler left far behind in the dust of the gallop. He felt the horse shift beneath him, sensing the violence, the animal's muscles bunching in nervous anticipation. But Hardin sat stone still, his heart rate slowing, his breathing even, a monster discovering his nature in the quiet aftermath of atrocity. The birds began to sing again, indifferent to the tragedy, and the sun continued its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out from the boy killer like grasping fingers, reaching for a future that would be paved with similar moments, a future where the count would rise and the soul would harden until it was indistinguishable from the iron on his hip. He holstered the weapon, the metal hot against his thigh, a brand of his new cast, and turned the horse, leaving the silence of the dead behind for the noise of the living, riding away not with the hurried panic of a fugitive, but with the measured trot of a man who knows that he has crossed the threshold from which there is no return, a fracture that would never heal, a fissure that would swallow 40 men before the devil finally came to collect his due. This was the birth of the phantom, the moment the boy died and the gunman was born, baptized in gunpowder and dry blood, riding into the mythic twilight of the West, where the only law was the one written in the cylinder of a six-shooter. And John Wesley Hardin, with eyes as cold and blue as the indifferent sky, knew that he was finally, terrifyingly home. The Texas sun did not merely shine. It bore down with the weight of a divine judgment, pressing the life out of the scrub oak and the red dirt until the very air shimmered with the heat of a kill, a suffocating blanket of atmosphere that trapped the sins of men against the earth. And in this crucible of heat and dust, John Wesley Hardin sat astride a mar that twitched its ears against the relentless assault of horseflies, his young spine stiff with a pride that had calcified long before his wisdom teeth had even thought to cut through his gums. He was a creature of the Reconstruction, a boy molded from the bitterness of a lost war and the jagged edges of a society that had fractured into lawlessness, where the only currency that held its value was the cold, unyielding weight of lead and the speed with which a man could summon it from the leather holster that hugged his hip like a lover. The road before him was a scar across the landscape of Polk County, a twisted ribbon of packed earth that wound through the pines, silent save for the rhythmic crunch of hooves and the cicadas screaming their mindless friction in the canopy above. But inside Hardin's mind, the silence was a roaring void, a cavernous space where his conscience should have resided, but where instead there sat a coiled viper of instinct, a reflex honed by the violent bedtime stories of the frontier where survival was not a right but a theft. He was 15, a number that in any other age would signify innocence, the precipice of manhood, but here in the shadow of the year 1868, it meant he was old. Enough to die and old enough to kill, a dichotomy that did not trouble him as he felt the heavy drag of the cap and ball revolver, Colt that smelled of oil and sulfur, a mechanical extension of his own volatile temper. The incident that would shatter the fragile porcelain of his soul in birth. The legend began not with a roar, but with a wrestling match, a grappling of sweaty limbs in the dirt with a man named Maje, a freedman whose strength was as undeniable as the color of his skin. And in that tussle, Hardin had felt the crushing humiliation of defeat, the grit in his mouth, the laughter of the onlookers stinging worse than the scrapes on his elbows, a burning shame that ignited a fuse in the dark powder keg of his ego. Now the road was the stage for the second act of retribution that his shattered pride demanded. For Hardin was a boy who could not abide the Memory of weakness, who felt every slight as a mortal wound that could only be cauterized by the finality of violence. He saw Maje up ahead, the man's silhouette distinct against the blinding white of the horizon, and the world seemed to narrow down to the tunnel vision of a predator. The peripheral details of the swaying trees and the soaring buzzards bleeding away until only the target remained, crisp and terrifyingly close. Hardin did not think. Thinking was a slow, clumsy process of words and morals, a luxury for preachers and politicians, whereas what surged through his veins now was pure kinetic potential, a lightning strike waiting for the ground. He called out, a sharp, cracking sound that split the heavy air, and as Maje turned, confusion knitting his brow, the time between the shout and the action evaporated, dissolved by the terrifying velocity of Hardin's hand. The Colt cleared leather with a sound like a whisper of death, a smooth practice arc that defied the physics of the moment. The hammer thumbed back with a click that was the loudest sound in the universe, a mechanical punctuation mark at the end of a sentence Maje hadn't even realized was being written. The explosion was deafening, a ragged tear in the fabric of the afternoon, and the recoil traveled up Hardin's arm, a jolt of affirmation that vibrated in his very marrow, confirming his dominance, his power, his terrifying agency over life and death. The ball struck true a sickening thud that was felt more than heard, and as the man crumbled, folding in on himself like a puppet with cut strings, the smoke from the barrel hung in the stagnant air, a gray ghost that refused to dissipate, clinging to Hardin's clothes, marking him. The echo of that first transgression did not simply fade into the vast, indifferent silence of the Texas scrublands, but rather burrowed inward, taking up residence in the hollow chambers of John Wesley Hardin's chest, a persistent ringing that harmonized with the shrill cry of the cicadas and the distant, mournful lowing of cattle that knew, with animal instinct, that the world had shifted on its axis, tipping precariously toward violence. For the boy who had ridden out that morning with the sun on, his face returned with the shadow of Cain stretching long and dark behind him, a shadow that would not detach itself, no matter how furiously he scrubbed the gun smoke from his hands or how deeply he buried the truth beneath layers of sullen silence. It was the year of our Lord 1868, a time when the wounds of the great Civil War were still weeping pus and blood across the South, and Texas was a land under the heel of Reconstruction, a place where the law was a blue-coated specter, and justice was a concept as fluid and murky as the Brazos River after a storm. And into this fractured reality young Wes had cast his die killing a man, Maje the freedman, in a dispute that history would whittle down to a mere wrestling match gone wrong, but which in the moment felt like the inevitable collision of two desperate souls fighting for dominance in a world that offered scraps only to the wolves. When he stood before his father, the Reverend James G. Hardin, a man whose life was built upon the bedrock of Scripture and the sanctity of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," there was no thunderous rebuke, no fire and brimstone summoned from the pulpit of the family hearth, but rather a terrifying, quiet resignation, a hollowing out of the eyes that was far worse than any strap or rod. For the Reverend looked upon his son not as a child to be corrected, but as a vessel cracked beyond repair, leaking the Holy Spirit until only the cold, hard instinct of survival remained. "You cannot stay here, Wes," the father said, his voice trembling with the weight of a patriarch who realizes he must sacrifice his Isaac not to God, but to the wilderness. "The law will come, and they will not bring mercy." And with those words, the tether that bound the boy to the concept of home, to the warm light of the supper table and the safety of a shared roof, was severe with the brutality of a butcher's knife, forcing him to pack a bedroll, a Bible he would seldom read but always carry, and the heavy Colt cap and ball revolver that was now his only true companion in the gathering dark. He rode out under a moon that looked like a skull suspended in a shroud of clouds, the landscape transforming from the familiar playground of his youth into a hostile alien geography, where every rustle of dry leaves sounded like the boots of the state police and every shadow cast by the gnarled mesquite trees took on the shape of a hangman. And as he put miles between himself and the only life he had ever known, a chilling numbness began to spread from his fingertips, up his arms, a callus forming not on his skin, but on his soul, freezing the guilt before it could fester into regret, because regret was a luxury for the living, and he was now a man marked for death. He sought refuge with relatives, moving from one safe house to another, but he found that he carried a contagion of danger, a palpable aura of impending violence that made women clutch their children tighter, and men look nervously at the horizon. For to harbor John Wesley Hardin was to invite the wrath of the Union soldiers who patrolled the country like an occupying army, their blue uniforms stained with the dust of a land they despised and sought to break. And so Wes learned the first hard lesson of the outlaw, that abandonment is not a singular event, but a continuous process, a daily shedding of connections until one stands utterly alone in the center of a hostile universe. He hid in the dense thickets of the Grand River bottoms, sleeping on the damp earth with his hand wrapped around the walnut, grip of his pistol waking with a start at the snap of a twig, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his eyes scanning the gloom for the glint of metal or the movement of a horse. And in those long, solitary hours, the boy died, and the gunman was born forged in the crucible of isolation, and tempered by the realization that in this new world the only law that mattered was the speed of the hand and the accuracy of the eye. He began to see the world not as a creation of God, but as a tactical map of ambush points and escape routes, evaluating every stranger not for their humanity, but for the threat they posed, his mind constantly calculating the geometry of death, the distance to the door, the cover offered by a table, the time it would take to draw and fire, and this hyper-awareness, this predator's focus, became his armor against the gnawing loneliness that threatened to consume him. The state police, a mix of carpetbaggers and freedmen armed with the authority of the victors, hunted him with the relentless persistence of hounds, and their pursuit drove him deeper into the violent subculture of the Reconstruction era, a world of cattle rustlers, feudists, and men who had forgotten how to pray. Men who accepted him not for his virtue, but for his utility, for his willingness to stand his ground when others fled. And thus he found a new family, a brotherhood of the damned who spoke in the clipped, grim language of violence and measured their worth in the notches on their guns. Yet even among these hard men, Wes was something apart, something colder and more precise. For while others killed out of anger or drunkenness or greed, Hardin seemed to kill out of a terrifying necessity, a reflexive action as natural as breathing. As if his conscience had been cauterized that day in the scrub when he dropped Maje, leaving behind a smooth, unblemished surface where morality could find no purchase. He remembered the smell of the rain on the sagebrush the night he lay in a ditch, while a patrol rode within yards of his hiding spot, their horses' hooves churning the mud, the soldiers joking about what they would do when they caught the little rebel. And he remembered the cold, metallic taste of fear in his mouth. Not fear of death, but fear of capture. Fear of the cage. And in that moment, shivering in the muck, he made a silent covenant with the darkness. He would never be taken. He would never submit to the chains of men who he deemed lesser than himself. And he would pave his road to freedom with as many corpses as required. This was the true abandonment, not the leaving of his father's house, but the abandonment of the hope that he could ever return to innocence, the acceptance that he was now a creature of the wild, a wolfhead in the eyes of the law, carrying a price on his existence that made every friendship suspect and every smile a potential mask for betrayal. As he rode deeper into the untamed heart of Texas, drifting toward the lawless, chaotic expanse of the frontier, the heat of the sun seemed to intensify, baking the mercy out of him, turning his blue eyes into chips of glacial ice that reflected the harsh, unforgiving landscape. And the legends began to grow, whispered in saloons and shouted from courthouses tales of a boy demon who could shoot the eye out of a bird on the wing, who killed with the impassive efficiency of a machine, stories that Wes wrapped around himself like a cloak. For if the world was going to call him a monster, he would be the most terrible monster they had ever seen, a nightmare made flesh to haunt the sleep of the Reconstructionists and the hypocrites. A gunman who had abandoned everything home, family, God, except the cold, heavy iron on his hip and the burning, unquenchable will to survive. The mud of the riverbank was not merely earth and water, but a primordial glue, a thick and suffocating paste that smelled of rotting catfish and ancient, decaying leaves binding John Wesley Hardin to the ground as if the land itself were trying to reclaim him, to pull him down into the subterranean dark before he could add another tally to the grim ledger of his soul. And there he lay, prone and motionless, a creature no longer of the sunlit plains, but of the shadows, and the mire his belly pressed against the cold, wet slick of the creek bed, while the reeds above him whispered, conspiratorially in the wind, obscuring the sky and the judgment of heaven from his sight. He had been moving for days, or perhaps weeks' time had lost its linear structure, dissolving into a muddy blur of adrenaline and exhaustion, and his boots were worn thin, the leather cracked and peeling like the skin of a shedding reptile, while his clothes, once the respectable garb of a preacher's son, were now stiff with dried sweat, river silt, and the copper-tang stains of blood that was not his own, transforming him into a rugged specter of the undergrowth, a thing of thorns and silence. The pursuers were close now, their presence announced not by the thunder of hooves, but by the deliberate, snapping cadence of branches breaking under the weight of cautious men. The blue-coated Reconstruction soldiers who moved through the Texas scrub with the heavy-handed authority of conquerors, their voices drifting through the humidity like smoke, carrying the alien cadence of the North, a sound that grated against Hardin's ears and stoked the embers of resentment that burned far hotter than simple fear. He did not tremble, for the capacity to tremble had been cauterized within him during the long sleepless nights of his flight, replaced by a cold, vibrating tension that was less like anxiety and more like the potential energy of a coiled spring, a deadly mechanics of the flesh that waited for the precise millisecond to release its violence upon the world. A horse snorted nearby, the sound wet and loud in the oppressive silence of the thicket, followed by the jingle of a bridle and the creak of saddle leather, sounds that painted a mental map in Hardin's mind, allowing him to visualize the geometry of the threat without lifting his head from the mud. 3 men, perhaps 4, fanned out in a searching arc, their eyes scanning the brush for the boy who had become a wolf. Hardin's hand, caked in dirt, rested on the grip of the cap-and-ball revolver tucked beneath his chest to keep the powder dry, the metal warming against his skin, becoming an extension of his own skeletal structure, a third hand that possessed the only authority he now recognized. He controlled his breathing, forcing the air in and out through his nose and shallow, silent draft, slowing his heart rate until the thumping in his ears subsided enough for him to hear the soft squelch of a boot sinking into the mud just 10 yards to his left, a proximity that would have sent a lesser man into a panic, but sent Hardin into a state of hyperclarity where the world slowed down, the colors of the moss and the gray bark of the cypress trees becoming vividly intense, etched in high relief against the gloom. He thought, briefly and distantly, of the concept of mercy, of the sermons his father had thundered from the pulpit about turning the other cheek. But those words felt like artifacts from a dead civilization, abstract noises that held no currency in the muddy reality of the creek bed, where the only law was survival, and the only judge was the man who drew first. The soldier stepped closer, parting the reeds with the barrel of a carbine, his face shadowed by the brim of his forage cap, a young face unlined and perhaps terrified, though Hardin did not care to analyze the humanity of the obstacle before him, seeing the man not as a father or a son, but as a silhouette of impending capture, a biological machine designed to end John Wesley Hardin's freedom. The crawl had changed him. It had stripped away the hesitation of civilization, the social contract that dictated a pause before violence, and replaced it with a predatory immediacy that bypassed the conscience entirely, creating a short circuit between the eye and the trigger finger. As the soldier's gaze swept over the log that concealed Hardin's form, the boy gunman did not rise to his feet to offer a challenge, nor did he cry out in defiance, but rather he shifted his weight with the fluid, soundless grace of a water moccasin, rolling onto his side in a single fluid motion that cleared the weapon from the mud, the hammer clicking back with a sound that was lost in the sudden eruption of thunder as he fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space of the thicket, a concussive blast that shredded the stillness and sent a cloud of sulfurous smoke billowing into the damp air. And before the soldier could even register the flash, the lead ball had found its mark, striking him in the chest and knocking him backward into the water with a splash that sounded obscenely cheerful against the grim finality of the act. Hardin did not pause to admire his work or to mourn the dead. He was already moving, scrambling through the mud on his hands and knees, a crab scuttling away from the light, as the other soldiers shouted in confusion and fired wildly into the brush. their bullets snapping through the leaves and thumping into the trees around him, searching for a ghost that was no longer there. He crawled through the mire, the sludge soaking his trousers, his knees scraping against hidden roots and stones, dragging himself deeper into the labyrinth of the swamp, where the horses could not follow his mind, empty of everything except the geography of escape. There was no guilt in him, no heavy mantle of sin weighing down his shoulders, only the ringing in his ears and the sharp, metallic taste of adrenaline for his conscience had been left behind miles ago, shed like a skin that no longer fit the creature he was becoming. He was a thing of the crawl now, a subterranean force that moved beneath the notice of polite society, surfacing only to strike and then vanishing again into the earth. And as he pulled himself up a steep, slick bank, gasping for air, he looked back at the drifting smoke and the ripples in the water and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of continuity, the knowledge that he was still, breathing still, moving still, the master of his own jagged destiny. The sun began to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the water, and Hardin rose to a crouch, wiping the mud from his face with a sleeve that was stiff with filth, his eyes scanning the horizon not for salvation, but for the next threat, the next ambush, the next moment where he would have to prove that his reflexes were faster than his morality, faster than the judgment of God, faster than the sorrow that threatened to drown him if he ever stopped moving long enough to feel it. He checked the cylinder of his revolver, rotating it to a fresh chamber with a practiced flick of his wrist, and then turned his back on the scene of the killing, slipping away into the gathering darkness, a silhouette dissolving into the night, leaving the dead to bury the dead while he continued his long, lonely crawl toward a legend that would one day be written in blood and whispered in fear across the entirety of the West. The silence of the bottomlands was a deception, a thin veneer of stillness stretched tight over a landscape that was screaming with invisible life. For as John Wesley Hardin rose from the mire, the mud flaking from his clothes like the shedding skin of a serpent, the world around him seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the violence that was no longer a possibility but a certainty. A grim destiny written in the iron of the pistol that now felt less like a tool and more like an extension of his own trembling hand, a heavy, cold prosthetic that pulsed with a dark heartbeat of its own. He moved not with the clumsy gait of the boy he had been only days before, but with the slinking, desperate grace of a hunted wolf, his boots sinking into the loam where the rot of centuries lay decomposing, the smell of wet earth and decaying cypress filling his nostrils until it choked out the memory of his mother, as kitchen and the scent of sun-dried linen replacing those innocent fragrances with the copper tang of fear and the sour metallic taste of adrenaline that flooded his mouth like bile. Behind him the woods were alive with the crashing of brush and the heavy rhythmic thudding of hooves, a sound that vibrated through the soles of his feet and traveled up his shins to rattle the very bones of his knees. The Reconstruction soldiers riding with the arrogance of men who believed the law as a shield rather than a target, their voices carrying through the dense foliage as disjointed shouts and curses that seemed to hunt him as effectively as their carbines. Hardin pressed himself into a tangle of briars that tore at his sleeves and drew thin ribbons of blood from his cheeks, the pain sharp and immediate, yet distant, as if it were happening to a stranger, for his mind had retreated into a cold, white room of calculation where only survival existed, and the stinging of the thorns was merely data to be acknowledged and discarded. He watched through the screen of leaves as the blue coats materialized from the green shadows, their horses foaming at the mouth eyes, rolling white with the heat and the tension of the chase, the leather of the saddles creaking, like the timbers of a sinking ship, and in that moment, seeing the sweat darken the armpits of the men who sought to put him in chains or the grave, Hardin realized with a terrifying clarity that they were not monsters, but men, meat and bone and blood, just like him, and this realization did not bring mercy, but a cold clinical understanding of their fragility. The leader of the posse, a man with a mustache that drooped like Spanish moss and eyes that scanned the undergrowth with the predatory boredom of a hawk, reined in his mount so close that Hardin could hear the animal, as jagged breathing and smell the sharp odor of chewing tobacco and horsehair, a sensory overload that threatened to snap the tenuous thread of his composure, forcing him to hold his breath until his lungs burned with the need for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate to break the cage of his chest. The soldier leaned over the pommel of his saddle, spitting a stream of brown juice that splattered against. A fern mere inches from Hardin's boot, a desecration of the hiding spot that felt like a personal insult, a challenge thrown down by fate itself. And as the man turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the briar patch, time seemed to liquefy, slowing into a thick syrupy crawl, where every detail was magnified to grotesque proportions. The stitching on the soldier's uniform, the rust on the barrel of his rifle, the fly landing on the horse's ear, and in this elongated second, Hardin's hand moved. It was not a conscious decision, not a command sent from the brain to the muscle with intent and malice, but a reflex born of the reptilian cortex, a bypass of the conscience that still whimpered in the back of his mind. For the Colt Navy was rising before he had even formulated the thought of killing, the hammer drawing back with a series of mechanical clicks that sounded like cracking knuckles in the quiet of the glade. The soldier's eyes widened, the boredom vanishing into a sudden, horrific recognition, his mouth opening to shout a warning that would never leave his throat. For the thunder of the gunshot shattered the world, a deafening roar that erased the birdsong and the wind, a singular, violent exclamation point that ended the sentence of the man's life before he could comprehend the grammar of his own death. The recoil traveled up Hardin's arm, a jolt of kinetic truth that locked his elbow and slammed the reality of the act into his shoulder. His chest erupting in a mist of red that hung in the humid air like a gruesome halo, painting the leaves of the scrub oak with the vivid, shocking color of arterial spray. Chaos erupted instantly, the other horses rearing and screaming in panic, the remaining soldiers shouting in confusion as their mounts twisted beneath them, fighting a bit, but Hardin was already moving, the smoke from his barrel swirling around him like a phantom shroud as he broke from the cover of the briars, not running away but flanking, moving with the terrifying fluidity of a creature that has accepted its role in the food chain. He did not feel guilt. The time for guilt had passed with the silence, replaced now by the searing heat of the barrel against his palm, and the frantic, rhythmic need to cycle the action, to be ready for the next threat, the next obstacle that stood between him and the horizon. He fired again, wilder this time, the shot going wide and tearing bark from a pine tree, but the intent was enough to scatter the pursuers, to turn the hunters into the hunted for just long enough to buy in the seconds he needed, and he ran, his boots pounding the earth, his lungs dragging in the powder-choked air, his mind finally catching up to his body, racing to comprehend the geography of the hell he had just created. The woods blurred into a streak of green and brown, a tunnel of motion where the only constant was the weight of the gun, and the knowledge that the boy who had hidden in the mud was gone buried beneath the body of the man he had just killed, leaving behind only this vessel of instinct and reflex, this John Wesley Hardin, who found that the pull of the trigger was faster than the voice of God, faster than the plea of mercy, faster than the very thought of sin. He scrambled up a limestone ridge, the rock tearing at his fingernails, his breath coming in jagged sobs that were not of sorrow but of exertion. And as he crested the rise and looked back into the darkening bowl of the valley, he saw the soldiers regrouping, small figures in the distance attending to the fallen, and he felt a cold, hard knot tighten in his stomach, not the nausea of sickness, but the solidification of a new and terrible resolve. The sun was beginning to dip below the western rim, casting long, bloody shadows across the Texas scrub, turning the red dirt into the color of dried. Gore and Hardin turned his back on the scene, holstering the hot iron against his hip, walking now, not running into the vast, indifferent embrace of the wilderness that stretched out before him, a cathedral of thorns and dust where he would wander, Cain marked not by God, but by his own quick hand, destined to be chased by the ghosts of men who died surprised, their final expressions etched forever into the gallery of his memory, watching him with accusing eyes from every shadow, every dark stand of trees, every silent moonlit mile. The reputation arrived before the man, spectral herald that whispered through the cracks in the floorboards and seeped through the batwing doors of the Abilene saloons long before John Wesley Hardin's boot heels ever struck the sawdust-strewn planks. For by now the name was no longer merely a label for a collection of bones and blood, but a curse, a heavy iron-bound syllable that sat on the tongues of men like a stone too large to swallow. And when he finally stepped out of the blinding white heat of the Kansas afternoon, and into the dim, amber-tinted purgatory of the bull's head. The atmosphere in the room did not merely shift, but solidified. The raucous laughter of the poker tables and the jagged, off-key tinkling of the piano dying of sudden, agonizing death, as if the air itself had been sucked out into the street to escape the presence of the tour, boy who had forgotten how to be a boy, and had instead become a vessel for a violence so pure and reactive that it defied the sluggish laws of human morality. He stood there for a moment, his silhouette framed by the harsh rectangle of sunlight behind him, a dark void cut out of the brightness, and in that pause, the sensory details of the room assaulted him not as a scene to be observed, but as tactical data to be processed. By a mind that had been honed into a razor's edge of paranoia and aggression, the smell of stale beer souring in the heat, the acrid bite of cheap cigar smoke that hung in blue strata near the tin ceiling, the sound of a heavy glass being set down with terrified care on a wet table, the specific rhythmic thud of a pulse visible in the neck of a drover 10 feet away, all of it washing over him, feeding the engine of his reflexes, and as he moved toward the bar, his gait was not a walk, but a glide. A fluid disruption of the space where his spurs chimed with a sound that was less like music and more like the tolling of a very small, very distant funeral bell. The bartender, a man whose face was a roadmap of broken capillaries and years of witnessing the worst of human nature, wiped a rag across the mahogany with a mechanical jerkiness, his eyes flicking toward the twin Colts that rested high on Hardin's waist, the leather of the holsters worn smooth and dark with oil and sweat, the ivory handles glowing with a dull, sickly luminescence in the gloom, and it was in this moment of suspended animation that the legend truly took hold, separating the man from his actions. For Hardin was no longer steering the ship of his own destiny, but was merely a passenger trapped in the current of his own mythos, a current that demanded blood to keep flowing. A voice cut through the silence, loud and thick with the false bravado of alcohol, a challenge thrown out by a stranger who had mistaken the quiet of the room for weakness, rather than the stillness of a predator before the strike. And as the words hung in the air, insults about Texas, about rebels about the size of the boy in the black hat, Hardin turned, not with the jerky indignation of the offended, but with the terrifying smoothness of a machine engaging a gear, his eyes finding the speaker, a burly teamster with a face like a slab of uncooked beef, and in that fraction of a second, the tragedy of John Wesley Hardin. Existence was laid bare. His hands were already moving before his mind had even registered the insult. The neural pathways of violence so deeply etched into his spirit that the decision to kill was not a decision at all, but a reflex, a spasm of muscle and tendon that bypassed the conscience entirely. The conscience, that slow and heavy thing, was still miles behind him, trudging through the mud of his past, weeping for the dead, but his hands God. His hands, they were creatures of light and speed, independent entities that knew only the geometry of the draw and the physics of the bullet. The room seemed to warp the edges of his vision, blurring into a tunnel of gray static, where only the teamster existed, the man's hand reaching for his own weapon with a slowness that seemed comical, a movement through molasses, while Hardin's pistols cleared leather with a sound like the cracking of dry kindling. The famous road agent spin, executing itself with a fluidity that was almost beautiful in its lethality, the barrels reversing, the hammers falling, and the twin explosions that followed were not separate sounds but a single, deafening roar that shattered the glass of the mirror behind the bar and drove a spike of pressure into the eardrums of every soul in the room. The smoke blossomed instantly, a sulphurous gray flower that tasted of brimstone and hellfire, expanding to fill the space between the killer and the two. Killed, and through that haze, Hardin watched with a detached clinical curiosity as the teamster was jerked backward by the invisible fist of the impact, the man's chest erupting in a spray of red mist that painted the air. His eyes wide with the sudden terrible understanding that he had gambled his life on a hand of cards he didn't know how to play. And as the body hit the floor, with the heavy wet thud of meat against wood, the silence returned heavier now, weighted down by the ghost that had just been birthed in the smoke. And this was the horror of it, the true dark heart of the legend. Hardin stood there, the smoke curling lazily from the barrels of his guns, and felt nothing. No triumph, no regret, no fear. The adrenaline that surged through his veins was cold, a glacial river that numbed him to the reality of the murder. And as his conscience finally caught up, stumbling into the room moments too late to stop the hand, it found the door locked against it. The heart hardened into something resembling obsidian, leaving him to look down at the smoking iron in his grip and realize that the guns were no longer tools he used, but masters he served. The patrons of the Bull's Head stared at him, their faces pale masks of awe and revulsion, and in their eyes he saw the reflection not of a man, but of a force of nature, a tornado or a flood, something that could not be reasoned. With or stopped only survived, and as he holstered the weapons with a precise metallic click that echoed like a judgment, John Wesley Hardin understood that he had killed the boy he used to be just as surely as he had killed the man on the floor, leaving only the legend, a hollow armored shell that would wander the west, seeking the next explosion, the next flash of powder, the next moment where the speed of his hand could outrun the screaming of his soul, forever faster than the guilt that nipped at his heels like a hound that could never quite close the distance, condemning him to a life where death was the only punctuation he knew how to use, a run-on sentence of violence written in blood across the dusty parchment of the frontier.